I'm Celeste Langford, 37 years old. Right now, I'm watching my model flash across the conference screen, without my name, without my version control tags, and without a single damn note from me. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Post your city and local time in the comments so I know where you're tuning in from. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft noise, and let's get started tonight. The lights dimmed slightly as the presentation kicked into high gear. That moment I knew. I knew because the color scheme was mine. I knew because the predictive model on the screen was the exact same version I had tuned with sleepless nights and black coffee for 6 straight months. But the voice at the front of the boardroom didn't belong to me. Damien Vale, freshly installed, head of strategic intelligence, was standing there, sleeves rolled to his elbows like some kind of casual savior, his voice calm, fluid, and absolutely false. "This model was developed by my team over the past quarter," he said, gesturing smoothly. My team. 2 words. That's all it took. I felt the oxygen shift. Heads turned toward him, not me.
People nodded, impressed.
Even the CEO, Donovan Trask, leaned forward like he was watching a savant perform. But this model? It wasn't built in the past quarter. It was 6 months of untangling legacy code, of rewriting data pipelines, of reinventing the entire logic structure from the ground up. And Damien? He wasn't even with the company when I gave the first closed-door walkthrough. But no one questioned it. No one asked. The model had numbers. The deck had polish. And Damien had timing. He even had the confidence to nod in my direction and say, "We're excited to continue iterating."
We.
The bastard hadn't just taken credit, he'd absorbed it, metabolized it, and projected it back with authority. When the meeting ended, I didn't rush out. I watched. I observed. I listened. That's when he approached me. Coffee in hand. Like we were peers. Like this was a game. "Good momentum in there, right?" he grinned. "Next time we tag team. You've got the back-end logic. I've got the voice." I didn't smile. "You forgot I also have the data." He laughed, as if I was teasing. "Well, we're all one team now. No need to keep score." But I wasn't keeping score. I was noting patterns. That afternoon, HR notified me that my role had been refocused. A polite phrase for a 15% pay cut and a sudden shift in title, downgraded to a senior specialist with cross-functional oversight. Damien, meanwhile, had created a rapid insights pod, stacked with former colleagues from his old firm who hadn't touched real model logic since Tableau had a desktop license. The insult wasn't the cut. It was the cowardice. The change came from his assistant, Mira, who'd been at the company for 3 weeks. She forwarded it with a chirpy note. "Let me know if you have any questions. Happy to clarify." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Instead, I checked the metadata in the file Damien had presented. Every tab still carried my user stamp. Every hidden calculation cell, every function chain, every bit of conditional formatting, mine. The logs were untouched. Version history, intact. That night, I opened a fresh notebook. Not digital. Not traceable. Matte black. No logo. Page 1. Distortion timeline week 1. Model stripped of author tags week 1. Salary adjusted without consent week 2. Strategy pod launched using misattributed IP below that. I wrote 2 names. Russell. Infrastructure access flag confirmed Elon. Legal liaison redline protocols intact because this wasn't just a theft. It was a miscalculation. Damien had stepped into a house he didn't build, moved the furniture, and thought no one would notice. But the house had memory. And I had designed it to remember. There's a quote I wrote on the bottom corner of that first notebook page. "When someone steals your voice, don't scream. Listen." I didn't rage. I didn't flinch. I recalibrated. The next morning, I didn't open my laptop until 10:03 a.m., just late enough to be noticed, just early enough to be plausible. I skipped the usual silent entry, skipped the hallway nods, skipped the rhythm I'd held for years. I wanted people to start seeing me differently. Less dependable. Less predictable. Let Damien think I was stunned. Let him think I was licking my wounds. He thrived on assumptions. He assumed that if he was loud and charming enough, the system would follow him. He assumed that if I didn't speak, I'd eventually fade into the margins. He assumed silence was surrender. It wasn't. It was set up. 2 hours into the day, my access to the resource indexing platform was quietly altered. No announcement. No policy update. My editor rights were downgraded to view only. Just like that, I became a spectator of the system I designed. I asked Mira casually over a coffee queue if she had noticed any login centralization changes. She blinked at me, completely unprepared. Oh, Damien mentioned something about umbrella credentials? We're consolidating access under a central schema now, like making it easier for everyone. She flipped through her tablet like it was a recipe book. I nodded once.
Sure.
Just let me know if you see any permission drops from my segment. Of course, she said, too brightly. Mira wasn't the problem. She was the insulation. The soft tissue surrounding a weak muscle, unaware that it was being used to lift weight it couldn't carry. Later that day, I logged into the Mirror archive, the legacy compliance vault that hadn't been decommissioned because it technically wasn't on anyone's budget line. Still alive.
Still mine.
3 files caught my eye. All 3 were copies of my original forecast model, sent from Myra's account to Damien's private inbox. She had no idea how metadata worked. No idea that opening a document created a signature. No clue that resaving it without redacting properties didn't wipe the source. Damien had renamed the file, changed a few headers, re-exported it with new branding, then uploaded it into the shared drive with a timestamp, 2:48 a.m. He didn't just want the model. He wanted to erase the shadow it cast. That night, I added another line to the notebook. Week 2. Forecast model altered, metadata intact and under it. Re-export time. 2:48 a.m. Source trace confirmed. The funny thing about systems? They don't forget, unless someone tells them to. But I never taught them how to forget. Only how to trace. I wasn't angry. I was measuring the width of the illusion. At 3:15 p.m., I opened Slack and posted a request in a public thread. At Mira, I noticed a discrepancy in my dashboard access permissions. Can you confirm whether we've rerouted admin rights away from solution architects? Her reply came 5 minutes later. Looking into it might be part of the new strategy pod restructuring. Smiley face. The smiley face was her signature. Cheerful, harmless, oblivious. But to anyone watching, the message said something else. Someone with deep access had been sidelined. And she was admitting it publicly. By the next day, I started sending files late. Just a version behind. Just enough for someone to notice. In meetings, I began asking obvious questions. Not because I needed answers, but because I wanted the others to hear the silences that followed. And I always left one breadcrumb behind, an unresolved ticket, a comment left hanging, a field labeled TBD in bright red. Damien thought I was slipping. Mira thought I was overwhelmed. But what I was actually doing was pressure testing. I wanted to know how long it would take before the system realized the person keeping it stable had quietly stepped off the ledge. Then came the call to Tova in procurement. Sharp, calm, tactical. The kind of person who doesn't offer help unless it's earned. Tova, I said, are Damien's requests coming through standard channels?
She paused.
Mostly through Mira. A few PDFs. No tags. No classification fields. But they're marked urgent under the new initiative flag. You didn't create that flag. No, she said flatly. But I'm letting it run. The audit trail is intact. I exhaled. Keep it that way. No problem. No alliance declared. No favors traded. Just understanding. Then I reached out to Russell again. Infrastructure. I said, I need the access grid to stay passive. No refresh. No cleanup. I'll need a reason. Performance latency. Tag it for review. That gives us 3 days. He hesitated then. You're isolating?
Exactly.
I want to see how they respond when the system asks for something they don't understand. Russell gave a short laugh. It's gonna get glitchy. That's the point. Systems don't betray. People do. And when you remove the wrong person, the system starts to stutter, like it's remembering what it lost. By Thursday, the first true fracture revealed itself. Jared Ellison, VP of External Strategy at Syntrex, our biggest data partner, sent a note. A simple one. It read, "Celeste, just checking in on the anomaly thresholds you mentioned. Haven't seen the update come through. Should I be worried?" Worried? I stared at his message, then scrolled back through our last exchange. He was right. I had promised him a full outline on the client-side detection layer 3 weeks ago. I hadn't forgotten. It just hadn't been delivered. Because Damien had intercepted the chain. He didn't know the technical language, but he knew how to repurpose what was already polished. And he thought if he said pipeline sync enough times, no one would challenge him. I responded evenly. It should have been deployed. I'll double-check the chain. Jared replied 2 minutes later. Thanks. That feature was the main reason we renewed early. There it was. Damien hadn't just hijacked the system. He was slowly undermining contracts built on trust, not deliverables. And Jared wasn't the kind of executive who waited twice. His questions would get louder. I didn't reply again. Instead, I closed the chat window and opened my notebook. Week 3. External partner flagged missing module risk layer not updated post-ownership shift potential breach of contract credibility. The ink bled slightly from the pressure of my pen. I remembered what Jared told me over lunch months ago. We didn't sign with you because the numbers dazzled. We signed because you knew what mattered before we even asked. That's when I stopped feeling cornered and started feeling ready. I scheduled a casual check-in with Jared the next day. No mention of Damien. No gossip. Just progress. Mid-call, he frowned. That logic tree you drafted, where's that sitting now? I said calmly, unclear. My permissions changed last week. Might be reallocated. Jared didn't say anything for 5 long seconds. Then he muttered, "That's strange. Real strange." I ended the call with, "Let me know if anything else feels off." That night, I opened the Syntrex contract. Line 47. Data models subject to modification only with oversight from original architect unless explicitly documented otherwise. They hadn't documented anything. I didn't smile. I just turned the page in my notebook. The next morning, something changed. Not externally. Not visibly. Internally. My posture when I walked through the doors at 9:01 a.m. was different. No more soft steps. No more quiet respect. I entered mid-traffic. Loud footsteps. Phone in hand. A nod here, a glance there. Presence, not performance. Because silence only creates power when it's paired with visibility. And Damien was only winning because he mistook quiet for weakness. Let him keep believing that. I dropped minor inconsistencies across his structure. Filed one report using a deprecated template. Submitted a revised draft of a dashboard I'd never touched, just to trigger confusion. Tagged Mira in 3 duplicate Slack threads asking for access I knew I didn't need. The goal wasn't to disrupt. It was to slow. And people started noticing. Mira pinged me. "Hey, weird queue, but are you on a different file version than me? Ethan says yours is missing some columns." I replied, "Oh, that's odd. I've only used what I had access to." She didn't respond. That afternoon, Damien stood in the hallway outside procurement, waving his tablet, clearly frustrated. "No one's syncing my priority queue." I heard him hiss. "This can't keep happening." I watched from the corner, sipping coffee. Nora, procurement lead, walked past me a minute later, holding a manila folder. As we passed, she slipped a page into my hand like it was nothing. Inside? A screenshot. One of Damien's recent purchase requisitions had skipped 2 mandatory checkpoints and self-tagged under an outdated policy. Executive discretion, legacy carryover. That flag had been deprecated 4 years ago. I jotted it down. Week 3. Purchase path breach policy misuse under expired flag systems don't lie. They break quietly. And when they contradict themselves, even the blind start seeing. Meanwhile, Lucy, Damien's ever-smiling assistant, started flooding Russell in IT with access tickets. "Can someone help?" Why are my admin rights timing out every 12 hours? Russell responded with exactly what I asked him to. Please escalate through platform control. Manual refresh not permitted, without authentication chain. Lucy forwarded that to Damien. He didn't reply. Instead, he booked a closed-door meeting with Donovan, the CEO. Labeled it Process Consolidation Proposal. I watched them walk in together. 15 minutes later, Jared from Syntrex called Donovan. His timing was sharp. Surgical. Just reviewed the new projections, Jared said, loud enough that half the floor could hear. And I have a question.
Pause.
Who designed the original anomaly thresholds? Damien opened his mouth, but Jared kept talking. Because whoever did that understood our risk model better than we did. And I'm not seeing that anymore.
Click.
He hung up. Damien stared at the floor. Donovan didn't say a word. Instead, he turned his laptop around and showed Damien the file. The metadata still intact. My name. My timestamp. My version number. A system can't forget what remembers how it was built. He didn't speak to me for 2 days after that. Not a glance. Not a nod. Damien Vale, the man who had practically oozed charisma in every corridor, now carried silence like a coat too tight across the shoulders. But I wasn't interested in eye contact. I was watching the walls shift. By Monday, a memo went out. All project documentation must now be routed through the strategy pod for final review. Translation: centralize control, obscure the chain. But Mira didn't know how to manage permissions. She simply renamed shared folders and reassigned ownership blindly, overriding edit histories with automated flags like Innovation Flow, Damien V.
Cute.
So I made sure to submit one file, the wrong one. A version from 6 weeks ago. Slower, less accurate, full of logical gaps. Mira approved it within 5 minutes. 3 hours later, Damien used it in a meeting with the analytics team. Mid-sentence, his chart contradicted itself. He blamed a data sync issue. No one corrected him. But I saw the way Reza from systems raised his eyebrow. I saw Farah from operations glance over at me. They were starting to understand. That evening, I opened Slack to a message from Nora. Simple, clipped, precise. 4th budget request in a row, failed routing. Nothing's getting through. I replied with 3 words. Then stopped submitting.
She didn't reply.
She didn't need to. Because this wasn't sabotage. It was weight. A kind of slow, patient collapse that didn't scream. It just shifted inch by inch until the ground beneath you no longer supported your ego. By midweek, the strategy pod calendar desynced. One of Damien's agile momentum huddles, his Monday morning parades of half-baked wins, was mysteriously absent from half the team's calendars. He blamed Outlook. Mira opened a help ticket. Russell marked it as pending queue priority and left it there. Because what they didn't know was that 2 years ago, we had installed a queue rebalancer, an invisible node that pushed non-credible events to the bottom of the sync hierarchy when system load peaked. Damien's profile had dipped below credibility threshold after his 3rd manual override attempt on restricted workflows. The system wasn't broken. It was rejecting noise. And the people who built it? We knew the difference. The next wave of failure was even quieter. That Thursday, the Logenics client dashboard stalled mid-presentation. Jared had been walking his stakeholders through a dynamic visual layer, a prediction engine I had designed to toggle live projections. Suddenly, the charts froze. Reloaded. Returned blank. Lucy, flustered, offered a bland apology. We're optimizing for live rendering, still tuning backend velocity. But I knew the truth. The portal hadn't crashed. It had revoked her trust token after 3 failed parameter matches under an unauthorized user session. The model had protected itself. Because that's how I built it. Not to please. To endure. Later that afternoon, I passed Damien near the huddle rooms. His voice was hushed, urgent, trying to sound confident but too clipped to convince anyone. We're reorienting legacy dependencies, he muttered to Donovan. Donovan paused, then asked quietly, Then why did you disconnect them before learning how they held together? He walked away before Damien could respond. That night, I updated the notebook. Week 4. Calendar sync failure. Credibility threshold triggered. Client model revoked. Trust token mid-session. CEO inquiry. Structural cohesion questioned. No one had raised their voice. No one had stormed a room. And yet, the damage was already spreading across the floor like an ink spill. You see, ego builds in public. But collapse? Collapse builds in whispers. Friday morning, the payroll system failed to process the bonus batch. Error. Validation path incomplete. Clearance hierarchy missing. Mira pinged finance. Finance pinged infrastructure. Russell just sent back a single line. Protocol mismatch. Please verify authorship tier. Because Damien had pushed a bonus allocation path through a deprecated channel. Again. One I had removed a year prior for being structurally unstable. Every small breach was plausible on its own. A glitch. A lag. A forgotten flag. But stack them? And it wasn't a coincidence anymore.
It was a pattern.
And systems, they don't survive patterns they weren't designed to carry. That afternoon, I walked past Mira at the printer. Her eyes were shadowed, mascara smudged. She clutched a misaligned spreadsheet like it might rearrange itself if she held it tight enough. Behind her, Damien was in a locked glass room, waving his hands, voice taut, pitched higher than usual. They still hadn't realized. The system wasn't rejecting them. It was simply remembering me. Because a structure doesn't serve the loudest voice. It serves the clearest one. And mine was embedded deep inside every uncredited, unedited cell. When you ignore the architect, don't be surprised when the roof caves in. Monday morning came with silence, but not the safe kind. Not the focused quiet of a team deep in flow. No, this was the silence of misalignment, of eyes glancing across open workspaces, trying to decode what hadn't been said yet. The first resignation came at 8:47 a.m. Tara Mendoza, Director of Client Delivery, submitted a 3-line email. Clinical. Detached. Effective immediately. I am stepping down from my role. Organizational misalignment has made it difficult to maintain project integrity. No farewell. No wrap-up notes. No flowers. Just absence. The kind that leaves a shape behind. Tara had once told me over coffee, this new guy doesn't ask the right questions. He performs strategy. He doesn't understand it. And now she was gone. By Wednesday, 2 more departures followed. Mid-level leads. Operations and data compliance. No drama. Just vacancies. Their names vanished from Slack. Shared folders turned gray. Meetings rerouted or quietly canceled. It wasn't mass exodus. It was surgical detachment. People weren't rebelling. They were retracting. Because trust, once fractured, doesn't shout. It recedes. In meetings, Damien doubled down on optimism. We're entering a transitional plateau, he said at the leadership sync, pointing at a pie chart that no longer reflected anything real. But momentum is building. No one responded. Lucy stumbled in late, juggling 2 folders and a coffee. The header on her printout didn't even match the content beneath it. Donovan noticed.
He didn't comment.
He just leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded. Because by now, even the CEO had stopped expecting clarity. Across the office, conversations got shorter. Emails doubled in attachments. Slack messages came preloaded with disclaimers, just looping in for awareness. Per our earlier exchange, please confirm. People weren't collaborating. They were shielding. Even Russell from infrastructure stopped auto-approving internal access requests. Nora in procurement locked down every purchase unless it was tagged compliance critical. And Adrian in finance? He halted all bonus automation pending manual verification. None of them asked me what to do. They didn't have to. Because when a system has been built for truth, people don't need loyalty to act. They just need a reason. And Damien had given them all one. Midweek, Jared from Logenics submitted a formal request. Reroute client servicing logic to prior configuration. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Donovan approved it within the hour. Damien didn't protest. At least not publicly. But something cracked in him that afternoon. His steps got sharper. His greetings more clipped. He no longer paused to smile in passing. He was moving like someone trying to outrun a system that was already closing behind him. That evening, I received a Slack message from Priya. She was junior, 6 months into her role, formerly trained under Tara, and someone I had once mentored during a reporting cycle.
Hey.
I've been asked to rebuild the risk model. Founder archived logic in the sandbox. It still works. Just thought you should know. I stared at the message for a moment, then replied, let it speak for itself. No ego. No credit chase. Just confirmation. That architecture didn't need a name. It just needed to be seen working, long after I'd been removed from the room. The failures continued. Small, sharp, untraceable if you didn't know what to look for. A template failed to load in HR's onboarding flow. The benefits dashboard froze mid-cycle during auto-renewal. A clause in contractor agreements failed to populate from the legal library. One by one, the seams that had held together the illusion began to loosen. Damien brushed them off in meetings as teething pains. We're still tuning the migration scripts, he'd say. Standard version drift. But there was no migration. There was no drift. Just consequence. Because systems don't fail from sabotage. They fail from silence. By Friday, Lucy submitted another ticket to IT. It was returned unopened. Brian had instituted a permissions filter, one we'd installed 2 years ago for critical escalations. It halted all fast-track executive requests pending signature verification. Lucy had no signature authority. Damien did. Or rather had. His digital ID had expired 3 days earlier. No renewal filed. The system hadn't rejected him. It had forgotten him. That same morning, Donovan tried approving the quarterly bonus batch. The platform returned a soft error. Insufficient clearance. Please consult system owner. He forwarded the message to Damien. No reply. Damien was too busy trying to understand why 3 key dashboards now returned blank grids. Why Logenics had bypassed his team entirely. Why meetings filled with people who wouldn't look him in the eye. There was no protest. No mutiny. Just disconnection. The architecture had stopped answering him. In the emergency sync that followed, Damien entered late. Eyes dark. Posture clipped. Lucy at his side, holding a jumble of printouts like a paper shield. He spoke fast, jittery. The systems are intact. We just need better visibility. Some of the back-end routing, Donovan didn't interrupt. He simply slid a page across the table. A metadata log. Author, Celeste Langford timestamp. 2 quarters ago file, anomaly_thresholds_final. V2 Damien opened his mouth.
Closed it.
Then from the far side of the room, Nora said quietly, I only ever saw one person fix it when it broke.
She didn't look at me.
She didn't need to. One by one, others followed. Brian, Adrian, even Priya from the back corner. No confrontation. No declarations. Just the truth, rippling quietly outward. The strongest system isn't loud. It's the one people defend in silence. Damien didn't show up the next day.
Not at his desk.
Not on any calls. Not even on Slack. But the tension didn't leave with him. Lucy sat alone, fielding confused pings from half the org, questions she wasn't equipped to answer. She wore exhaustion like a badge of confusion, eyes darting across screens that no longer obeyed her. At 10:12 a.m., an automated alert from the compliance portal hit my inbox, a copy, probably legacy routing, not intentional. The subject line, policy exception request, vendor overlap flagged. Attached, one of Damien's requisition trails. A redline note in the margin from Nora. Vendor path tagged as legacy flex. This category has not existed since FY3. Resubmit with active routing or escalate. Damien had tried to override a procurement protocol with a phantom code. Not bold.
Desperate.
I open my notebook again. Week 5. Unauthorized vendor routing under deprecated policy compliance alert triggered via legacy policy exception protocol, and below it, I wrote a phrase that had begun to loop in my mind, over and over. Collapse never looks like thunder. It looks like paperwork. That afternoon, the internal bonus logic broke again. This time, it overpaid an entire division by 18%. Adrian from finance escalated it. But instead of looping in Damien's pod, he quietly routed it to Donovan's office, along with a time-stamped model attribution chart. Damien's name wasn't listed. Mine was. Donovan didn't respond, not by email, not in person. But I saw the flags he placed on the internal compliance dashboard. A quiet shift. From observation mode to active cross-check. The system wasn't just watching anymore. It was remembering. Meanwhile, Mira continued her silent spiral. She approached Brian near the elevator, visibly frustrated. I submitted that request twice. I don't know why it stuck. Brian shrugged. Routing changed. Platform control requires alignment. I can't touch it without triggering escalation. She blinked. Then escalate. Brian's face remained blank. Escalation needs verified linkage to origin schema. And yours doesn't have it. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. That's when I knew. Even the safeguards were letting her slip through their fingers, not out of malice, but because she was never wired into the structure to begin with. She had inherited authority, but not legitimacy. Later that day, I passed Nora by the elevators again. She walked slowly, brows slightly furrowed, eyes tired. No one's approving, she murmured. All paths lead nowhere. I've submitted the same vendor loop 4 times this week. I didn't stop walking. I just said, then stop submitting. She nodded once. A quiet alignment. No loyalty required. Just recognition. Because in systems built on integrity, rebellion doesn't take the form of noise. It takes the form of refusal. The next morning, I arrived to find half the 4th floor's auto notifications disabled. Slack integrations failed. Report triggers misfired. Performance dashboards blinked between outdated versions. Lucy posted a public note. Hey, everyone. Working on syncing issues. Let me know if you're seeing weird lag. No one replied. Because by now, everyone knew that lag wasn't the problem. The system wasn't slow, it just didn't recognize the hands touching it anymore. That weekend, the org's internal messaging app flagged a new status. Maintenance hold. Origin schema undefined. I smiled. Because I remembered installing that check myself. It was buried inside a subroutine labeled continuity confirmation, originally designed to alert us when a core process ran without attribution lineage. It had never triggered before.
Until now.
I didn't log in to fix it. I just watched. That Sunday, I received a message from Vanessa Lowe, former HR lead, now embedded in the external audit firm quietly retained by the board. Your documentation standards saved 3 departments. The board will see the rest in the full report. No flair. No praise. Just acknowledgement. I didn't reply. Not out of ego. Out of intent. Because this was never about revenge. It was about restoration. By Monday, Lucy's name had vanished from the org chart. No announcement. Just an error message. User profile not found. Slack channel history scrubbed. Calendar wiped. People noticed. No one asked. Damien returned mid-morning. Shirt wrinkled. Eyes dull. He didn't speak to anyone. Just sat at his desk, scrolling, pausing, starting again. He tried booking a sync. The invite failed. He sent a ping to Jared at Logenics. No reply. He submitted a request to reactivate the bonus interface. It bounced back. Insufficient clearance. He flagged Brian. Brian redirected him to legacy compliance. He sent one last ticket to Donovan. It remained unread. At noon, a company-wide email went out. Subject: Leadership Transition Notice Body. Effective immediately, Damien Vale will be stepping down as head of Strategic Intelligence. Interim guidance will be led by a cross-functional operational council while long-term needs are reassessed. No sender. No signature. No thanks. Just system language. Like removing a corrupted line of code. That afternoon, a file landed in my inbox. From Priya. They've asked me to rebuild the model. But this time, they told me not to change the author tag. I read it twice. Then logged out of every admin credential permanently. Because my work was never about authority. It was about alignment. A legacy doesn't announce itself. It's what remains when noise stops. The final chapter didn't unfold with drama. It happened in fragments, small, understated corrections that told a much bigger story. On Wednesday, someone from Donovan's office submitted a directive through internal compliance. Review all platform policies developed prior to Q2. Evaluate continuity protocols against original authorship structures. No name attached. Just a timestamp. I didn't need attribution.
They weren't asking for me.
They were asking for what I'd built and what they had erased. That afternoon, I passed Donovan in the hallway. He didn't pause, didn't offer a smile. He just said, "Looks like you were right." I turned slightly. I wasn't trying to be. He nodded. That's why it worked. Then he walked away. No applause. No redemption arc. Just recognition. Exactly the way I preferred it. Weeks later, I got one last note, handwritten, folded into thirds like a high school letter. No name on the envelope, but I recognized the tight block handwriting immediately. Jared from Logenics. It said, the silence made more sense than any presentation. I tucked it into the back of my notebook, right behind the distortion timeline. The last page I touched. The timeline itself? I hadn't updated it in weeks. Not because the system was fixed, because I wasn't part of it anymore. I never attended the transition council Donovan assembled. They sent me a soft invite, a courtesy framed in polite language, masked as continuity stewardship. I declined. Not out of spite, because I knew what they really wanted. They weren't inviting me back. They were trying to recover what they had lost. But legacy doesn't live in calendars or job titles. It lives in understanding. And you can't request that through a shared doc. Instead, I joined a smaller firm. No glossy slide decks. No buzzword rituals. A team that treated systems like living things, not toys. My new title was almost laughably simple. Director of Structural Continuity. Quiet. Precise. It held everything that mattered. I didn't hire a team. People came anyway. They brought questions, not to impress me, but because they knew I wouldn't answer with noise. I'd answer with clarity. One afternoon, Priya showed up. She'd left the company 2 weeks earlier. No warning. No drama. Just gone. She didn't ask for a role. She just asked, "How do you know when a system is healthy?" I looked up, took a breath, and answered, "When it functions without fear." She stayed. Others followed. Analysts. Operators. Even a few from Donovan's original leadership staff. Not because I recruited them. Because something followed them here, something they remembered. A system that made sense. I started a cohort. Not a training. Not a program. A space. For professionals over 40. People who'd been labeled legacy weight.
Caretakers.
Ex-consultants. Quiet architects. We didn't talk about KPIs or innovation funnels. We talked about pressure. About how the first people asked to leave are always the ones holding the most weight. There were no cameras. No presentations. But every month the room filled. Every seat. Every time. I never sent a resignation letter. Just a final system directive. A rule embedded in the architecture. Terminate my access once baseline drift exceeds integrity variance. The drift was triggered the day Damien tried to overwrite the system schema. The system revoked me quietly. I never had to log out. It logged me out. That was enough. Weeks later, Monica, my old infrastructure partner, forwarded a company-wide update from OrbiX. Effective immediately, all legacy protocols will be reviewed under original author standards. Continuity will be measured not by delivery speed, but by systemic understanding. Legacy attribution is now classified as critical infrastructure risk. No author. Just a timestamp. I didn't reply. Not because I wasn't proud, but because even now, they hadn't learned how to say it plainly. They weren't trying to recover me. They were trying to recover the silence I once protected, the weight they only noticed after it was gone. And that's the thing about legacy. It doesn't live in titles. It's not printed on org charts. It doesn't scream during quarterly reviews. Legacy is what remains when you remove the person and the structure still breathes correctly. Because someone once cared enough to build it that way. Real systems don't die when you leave. They echo. The final break didn't come with an announcement. It came with silence, complete, unsparing, clinical. At 9:05 a.m. on a Thursday, Damien attempted to log into the strategic dashboard for the quarterly risk pulse. His credentials returned a soft denial. Session expired. Token unrecognized. Please consult system administrator. There was no administrator. There was no fallback. Because the system didn't reject him out of error. It rejected him because he was no longer part of the memory that held the doors open. I found out from Mira. Not through words, but through posture. She was standing in the kitchen, frozen, staring at the espresso machine like it had insulted her family. A tablet hung loosely in her hand. When I passed, she flinched. They changed the token parameters, she muttered, mostly to herself. Even the override's gone. I didn't answer. She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking to the air, the room, the space that had begun to echo differently. That same day, procurement requests began bouncing with unresolvable ID errors. Finance flagged 5 misrouted tax flows that were previously tagged as compliant. And HR reported a mirror drift in the onboarding workflow, meaning the templates were pulling language from deprecated branches that shouldn't exist anymore. But they did, because Damien had built over live wires with no insulation. And now the system was remembering the sparks. That afternoon, I passed Russell in the hallway. He nodded once, then said without context, QNode rebalanced itself. Token weight under 0.48. Auto-muted. Translation: Damien's system presence had dropped below credibility again. The algorithms silenced him. No one had to code it. It was always there, built to trigger in case of a structural vacuum. We never told leadership about that layer. It was a quiet insurance policy. One that didn't punish, but excluded. That's the thing about systems grounded in truth. They don't retaliate. They forget. That night, I received one last auto-forwarded alert from the system I once owned. Process integrity gap detected in flow owner structure. Please verify schema anchor. There was no valid anchor, which meant the system was no longer owned. Just circulating. It wasn't broken. It was drifting. The next morning, I found myself watching an all-hands video call out of curiosity. Donovan's face looked older than I remembered. His tone was tighter, more careful. Behind him, the company logo flickered slightly, the way it always did when the screen refresh lagged under load. He said, "We're entering a phase of quiet rebuild. There will be no restructure, no headline, just recalibration. Slowly, methodically." He didn't mention Damien.
He didn't mention me.
That was how I knew it was real. When a company stops naming the problem, that's when the damage has settled deep enough to become a scar. 2 weeks later, I got a message from someone I barely remembered. Oren Kim. Used to sit 3 rows behind me in the strategy bay. Always polite. Always a little too eager. His message read, "We've been trying to reroute permissions, but everything's cross-looped to deprecated chains. Did you leave a failsafe?" I replied with one line. No failsafe. Just a structure that needed truth to work. He didn't answer. By the end of that month, the board commissioned a full external systems audit. Not because they wanted a villain, but because too many layers had become unexplainable. Dashboards wouldn't load. Approval flows contradicted themselves. Legacy tags pointed to schema trees that had no current owners. The system hadn't crashed. It had simply stopped responding to commands that lacked legitimacy. That's when Donovan, privately and without fanfare, re-enabled one specific visibility node. The baseline anomaly projection model. My name reappeared. No announcement. No attribution memo. Just one field, quietly updated. Author. Celeste Langford, and within a day, usage resumed. No one cheered. No one asked questions. They just used it. Because that's how a real legacy works. It doesn't ask to be reinstated. It proves its worth in silence. When architecture collapses, it doesn't explode. It just stops answering. It started with a message misrouted through an internal compliance alias. Subject: Schema recovery request. Deferred pathways unavailable. Attached, a workflow trace looping endlessly between 3 expired approval tags, all labeled under the now-defunct strategy pod structure. The system wasn't just confused. It was stalling, circling broken logic like a compass spinning without north. Donovan forwarded it to Brian with a short note. "Why is this still happening?" Brian's reply was surgical. Original architecture suppressed. Current hierarchy has no anchor. No emotion. Just fact. A system without memory isn't agile. It's blind. By Wednesday, the delay logs doubled. Vendor onboarding time increased by 68%. Finance escalations took 2.3x longer to resolve. Contract renewals were timing out before reaching legal. Lucy was long gone. Damien hadn't been mentioned in over a week. But their shadows still jammed the gears. Because systems remember structure long after they forget names. I received another message from Oren. This one was shorter. Tried building a new flow. Pulled your archived logic again. Still works. Still works. He wasn't surprised anymore. He was resigned. And that's what corporate erosion really looks like. Not flames. Not leaks. Just quiet dependency on what was once erased. I replied, "If it still works, it never stopped mattering." And then I opened my private sandbox for the first time in weeks. Inside it, all 22 modules of the original architecture intact, airlocked from central servers, read-only by design, shielded from overwrites. I didn't reopen them. I didn't need to. Their survival was the message. That same evening, Donovan sent a company-wide notice. Not a dramatic one. Not bold or loud. Just this. In light of ongoing process latency, all legacy schema reviews will now be tied to attribution lineage. No process shall be deployed unless its origin is verifiable. No one said my name, but the system had. Quietly. Continuously. Unfailingly. And that was enough. By Friday, a new email signature appeared in internal directories. Priya Banerjee, interim lead, systems intelligence, attribution custodian. She had inherited a title no one had used before. One that didn't carry power. Only responsibility. And as I watched her Slack updates, methodical, structured, humble, I felt something shift in me. Not pride. Relief. She wasn't copying me. She was listening to the same system I had. At 3:22 p.m. that day, a document populated into my sandbox, unrequested. File name, integrity snapshot _Q4_final, PPTX. I opened it. It was a presentation prepared by Priya for the board. Slide 2 included a bullet point. Architecture rollback enabled by original process chain authored by Celeste Langford. Model required no re-engineering. Logic self-reconciled upon attribution reactivation. I stared at it for a long time. Didn't scroll further. Didn't respond. Because it didn't require action. Just presence. Later that night, I added one last line to the notebook I hadn't touched in weeks. Week 9. Recovery initiated not through command, but through recognition. Then I closed the cover. Not ceremoniously. Not symbolically. Just completely. Because you don't measure legacy by who holds the file. You measure it by who reaches for it when everything else stops working. The proof of your presence isn't in the room. It's in the system that still responds to your silence. The air had changed. Not just around me, but around the whole organization. You could feel it in the way meetings opened, slower, more cautious. In the way junior analysts triple-checked data lineage before speaking. In the way Donovan stopped asking who's responsible and started asking who designed this. Because ownership wasn't about accountability anymore. It was about memory. That Monday morning, I received a package. Not from the company. From a courier. No return address. Inside, a printed flowchart. Old school. Color-coded. Annotated. At the top, version 1.0, continuity backbone, and in faint pencil on the bottom corner. If this ever breaks, start here. It was mine. A copy I'd drawn up years ago in a workshop session when we still whiteboard with dry erase markers. Someone had saved it. Someone had kept it. Someone had scanned it and printed it again when everything else failed. Legacy doesn't live in slide decks. It lives in drawer-bottom diagrams no one throws away. At noon, I got a message from Jared at Logenics. You might want to know, OrbX just tried to reassign schema certification to a third-party vendor. We pushed back. Told them any change to the anomaly layer requires original schema logic or full system rebuild. I said it without blinking. I didn't respond. Not out of dismissal. Out of deep, almost unbearable clarity.
They weren't defending me.
They were defending the thing that had protected them. That same afternoon, the Cross-Functional Stabilization Council finally issued its first report. It wasn't distributed broadly, just sent to Donovan. But a copy, naturally, ended up in my inbox via Priya. Page 5 outlined the collapse timeline. They hadn't called it that, of course. They used terms like integrity drift and workflow fragmentation. But I knew what it really was. The vacuum left behind when Damien Vale deleted the name but couldn't recreate the mind. The kicker? The Council's top recommendation: reinforce systems with embedded architectural logic. Ensure structural leads are documented at time of creation. Attribute continuity not to function, but to the person who knew why the system was needed in the first place. There it was. The reversal. A quiet admission that the platform had survived, but only because a system built for continuity will choose stability over personality every time. By Wednesday, Priya forwarded me a message from one of the newer strategy associates. Hey, I don't understand half of the legacy documentation, but the moment I run the archived version, everything aligns. Can we build training around this instead of replacing it? Priya's response was perfect. We don't replace what works. We learn why it does. That week, I noticed something subtle but telling. People had stopped referring to the work as Celeste's model. It had become something else. Not anonymous. Not detached. But integrated. As if the work had transcended its creator, finally. And in that integration, it had become immune to the next Damien, or the next Lucy, or the next shortcut. That was the goal all along. Later that evening, I sat in a quiet space, our cohort room. The one we used monthly. The chairs were all filled. No formal agenda. Just quiet voices sharing stories of being overwritten, overruled, sidelined, and quietly indispensable. One woman, early 50s, said it best. They called me legacy until everything failed. Now they call me essential. We didn't clap. We just let the words settle. Because in that room, no one needed noise to validate truth. On my walk home that night, I received a final Slack ping from Mira. Unexpected. I didn't know about any of it. I thought I was just doing what I was told. I didn't realize I was erasing someone.
I stared at it for a long time.
Then replied, I wasn't erased. The system was just quiet long enough for you to forget who built it. Legacy isn't what survives you, it's what others return to when they're lost. A month passed, then another. The system stabilized. Not through innovation, through reversion. They didn't rebuild it, they returned to it. The dashboards, once blank and confused, now updated smoothly. Workflows previously gridlocked now passed with clarity. The process felt steady. Not because it had been modernized, but because people had stopped trying to force their names onto things they didn't understand. One day, I received a quiet knock on my office door. It was Adrian from finance. He looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. He sat down without preamble, opened his laptop, and turned the screen toward me. A list of model dependencies, color-coded by origin. I ran the audit you mentioned, he said. Turns out over 40% of our operational stability still ties back to your schema, directly or indirectly. I raised an eyebrow. That doesn't surprise you? He smiled faintly.
No.
But now, it surprises everyone else. Then he said something I didn't expect. They used to call it technical debt. Now they call it institutional memory. The shift had begun to settle into culture. Documentation styles started referencing rationale, not just formulas. New hires were encouraged to trace origin paths before proposing replacements. And in a strange full-circle moment, I saw an internal document titled Designing for Quiet Resilience, authored by Priya. It read like something I would have written years ago, not copied.
Groan.
And that's how I knew I'd done it right. One evening, while closing out a design session with my new team, a junior analyst stayed behind. She looked hesitant, then asked, "What's the one thing that matters most in designing systems people can't see?" I thought for a moment. Then I answered, "Design for absence." She blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means, assume one day you'll be gone. And if the system can't function when that happens, then it never worked." She wrote it down, not because I told her to, because something in her understood it wasn't just a line. It was a requirement. Later that week, I received one final email from Orbiex. Not from Donovan. Not from legal. Just a neutral alias. Infra-handoff@Orbiex, the subject line. Legacy model flagged as canonical structure. Transfer complete. Inside, a log of 147 workflows now formally tied to my original architecture. At the bottom, schema anchors finalized. Lineage verified. No further action required. I stared at the last sentence for a while, then quietly whispered, "Exactly." Around that time, Jared from Logenics sent one last handwritten note. Just 3 words. It held. Always. No return address. No contact info. Just folded paper and truth. I placed it beside the timeline notebook. I hadn't opened that one in months.
Didn't need to.
The timeline had ended. But not the work. Not the philosophy. Because every system I design now began the same way, with a silent assumption that one day, my name would vanish from it. And if it still worked after that, then I'd succeeded. If not, then I had built it wrong. It was never about being remembered. It was about not being needed. Not once the structure stood. The best legacy is one that doesn't require a monument, only continuity. 3 months after Damien's exit, the organization had changed, not visibly, but fundamentally. The corridors were quieter, the air less anxious. Meetings ran shorter. Questions were sharper. People no longer rushed to be seen. They came to be understood. And what struck me most was how little my name came up anymore. Not in meetings, not in memos, not in praise or blame. That was the point. I hadn't just left. I had made leaving sustainable. One morning, Priya sent me a screenshot. No subject, no commentary. Just a config update in the system's backend. A single field changed from owner, strategy, veil to owner. Verified schema, baseline anchor. There was no reference to me. But I knew exactly what they'd done. They had removed personality from process. Finally. That week, I was invited to speak at a small conference on systems architecture, not the flashy kind, but the sort organized by people who still printed their handouts and preferred pencils to PowerPoint. The panel topic, Sustainable Systems, Designing with Endings in Mind. They asked if I could talk about transitions. I said no. "I can talk about silence," I replied. There was a pause on the other end of the call. Then the organizer said, "That'll do." At the event, someone in the crowd, mid-30s, probably operations, asked, "If you could rebuild everything from scratch, what would you do differently?" I smiled. I wouldn't build faster. I'd build slower. They frowned. Slower? Speed is easy. Stability is expensive. And you can't scale something that was never meant to hold weight. No applause followed, but the pens moved faster. Back in my new office, we implemented a protocol called resilience drift. Every quarter, we tested whether systems still performed at 90% efficiency without human intervention for 48 hours. It wasn't about showing off. It was about proving what didn't need to be said anymore. And when a system passed, we archived the creator's name. Not removed, just stored quietly. Because legacy isn't a brand. It's a burden you choose to relieve others from. One afternoon, I got an anonymous envelope. Inside, a laminated ID badge.
Old.
Faded.
Mine.
It had a note stuck to the back. Found during a desk reset. "You left it behind. Thought you might want it." I didn't. But I appreciated the gesture. I placed it in a drawer, next to the handwritten notes, and closed it slowly. Not out of nostalgia. Out of ritual. Because some closures need to be honored, even if they no longer carry weight. That same day, Russell sent me a link. It was a Slack thread from OrbiX. An internal one, posted quietly in a back channel for the infrastructure circle. Topic: reconciliation failures in non-attributed schemas. In the comments, someone wrote, "If we just preserved the baseline instead of polishing it, we wouldn't be here." Another replied, "Yeah, but now we know better." That was enough.
Because that's what this all came down to.
Not getting credit, but watching people grow past the need for correction. And in that, I found peace. I stepped into my team's Friday debrief. The topic? System fatigue versus system fluency. The conclusion? If your system tires people, it's not a system. It's an obstacle. I didn't say much. Just listened. And as I watched Priya guide the discussion, I realized I could disappear again tomorrow, and it would keep working. Because I hadn't built a process. I had built a way of thinking. When you teach people how to think, not just what to use, you never leave. I didn't mark anniversaries. But exactly 1 year from the day Damien Vale introduced my model without my name, the system pinged a familiar alert. Baseline projection schema approaching integrity variance threshold. Attribution check. Passed. The system had corrected itself. Automatically. Quietly.
Completely.
I sat back in my chair, hands folded, not smiling, not moved, just still. Because systems like that don't need applause. They need room to breathe. That afternoon, a new analyst at my firm, Shay, just 3 weeks in, slid into a conversation where the team was dissecting a recurring data lag. He hesitated, then said, "It's probably the access chain, not the query." I checked the user weight, it's misbalanced. The rest of the team turned to look at him, mildly impressed. But I only nodded once and said, "Keep tracking the quiet failures. They always tell the loudest stories." He grinned, almost in disbelief. "You really believe that?"
Not believe, I said.
"I've survived it." Back at OrbiX, I learned from Priya that the new leadership didn't replace Damien with a single executive. They created something called a continuity mesh. A set of rotating chairs across data, finance, procurement, and systems, each granted temporary schema stewardship. No vanity titles. No applause cues. Just function. They'd finally started listening to the architecture. That week, I was asked to review a proposal for a government analytics firm. Their pitch was sleek.
Polished.
Beautifully empty. Buzzwords everywhere. Diagrams nowhere. After the meeting, the director pulled me aside. "What did you think?" I said. "Looks like it was built to impress, not to survive." He blinked. "That bad?" "Not bad. Just unready." Then I handed him a sheet of paper I'd written on during the pitch. At the top, 5 questions every structure must answer before it earns trust. He read the first line. 1. What happens when the person who built this is gone? He looked up. "Did you invent this?" I paused, then said, "No." I just made sure it was never forgotten. That night, I walked past my old building. Just once. Not nostalgic. Curious. The lights were on. Fewer people inside. Less noise. But for the first time, I didn't feel a pull to re-enter. Because I knew something they still didn't. I hadn't left a vacancy. I'd left a blueprint. A week later, I hosted another cohort gathering. This time, one of the new attendees, mid-40s, ex-consultant, asked, "What's the difference between a process and a system?" Someone from across the room, one of our longest-running participants, answered before I could. "A process gets you through the day. A system gets you through the storm." Everyone nodded. No one needed slides. I found myself writing again. Not code. Not logic. Essays. Reflections. Things I'd never had time for when I was managing systems constantly at risk of becoming someone else's shortcut. One piece I wrote was titled, "The Quiet Exit. When your best work doesn't need you anymore." It was shared quietly on a niche knowledge platform. No promo. But it spread. People began quoting it in places I never expected: compliance blogs, data forums, even HR handbooks. One day, Priya messaged me, "Found your essay referenced in a procurement training manual. Line 38. Trust is a function of structure, not sentiment." They didn't credit you. I replied, "That's how I know it's working. Because if the words lived without me, then the system did too. When your absence improves the system, you've done more than build, you've taught." The turning point came when Orbix announced a permanent shift. No single schema could ever again be owned by one person. They called it distributed architecture stewardship. But I knew what it really was. An apology, without the word sorry. An admission that the weight had once been concentrated in a single pair of hands, and when those hands were cut out, everything trembled. That same week, a former colleague, Dina, reached out. We hadn't spoken since the early Damien days. Her message was cautious, almost shy. "Just saw they reinstated your architecture schema as the reference frame." Quietly. No broadcast. I'm glad. It was always the only one that actually held. I typed, deleted, then typed again. "You don't need a monument when the ground still holds." She responded with a single emoji. Brick a brick. Exactly. Meanwhile, back at my firm, we were piloting a mentorship loop called Anchor Threads. Every senior systems architect was paired with a legacy operator, someone from another industry entirely: logistics, healthcare, even aerospace. The idea was simple. You don't design for future stress unless you've lived past strain. And over time, it worked. Designers started asking better questions. Fewer: how fast can it scale? More: what breaks first when no one is watching? That shift was everything. I watched Shay lead a review session one Thursday. She was mapping a data lineage for a hospital partner and paused mid-sentence. Then said, "We need to build this like we're going to forget it exists for a year. And when we come back, it should still make sense." The client blinked, then slowly nodded. That line would go on to be part of their internal onboarding deck. Another echo planted. Later that week, I was asked to speak, virtually this time, at a global infrastructure symposium. The moderator opened with, "You've been credited with designing systems that outlive organizational memory. How do you ensure that?" I answered, "Design every element like no one will defend it when you're gone." They paused, then said, "So your work wasn't built to be protected?" "No," I said. "It was built to protect itself." That's the difference. The next day, I received a Slack message from Oren. "We're rolling out a new compliance portal, and we're calling the schema Logic, Langford Base. Just thought you'd want to know." I didn't reply. Instead, I highlighted his message and saved it. Not to gloat. To remind myself that sometimes the impact you never announce is the one that lasts. At the end of the month, during a team lunch, someone asked, "What's the simplest rule for system integrity?" I responded without thinking, "If a system requires memory of you to function, it's unstable." They laughed. "Even if you're brilliant?" "Especially if you're brilliant," I said. Because brilliance without duplication is a liability. Later that night, as I walked home through the quiet streets, I found myself thinking about that early notebook. The one with the first entry. Week 1. Forecast model stripped of author tags. It sat in my drawer now. Untouched. Complete. I never opened it anymore. Not because the work was done. Because the message had already rippled. It didn't need rereading. It had been received. When the work echoes without you, you've become part of the foundation. In early autumn, I received a package. No sender, just a return address linked to a neutral P.O. box in Midtown. Inside, a printed schematic of my original anomaly routing logic, annotated, updated, and rebranded. At the bottom, one sticky note. "We mapped the new architecture against your anchor. Yours was more stable. We left it intact." No name, no signature, just a quiet decision made in a boardroom I would never re-enter. I sat with that for a long time. Not triumphant, just affirmed. There's something deeply humbling about being restored in silence. At the next cohort session, a woman named Lena shared something that hit like a pulse through the room. They didn't promote me, but they built the new structure around what I left behind. A few heads bowed. Others just closed their eyes, letting the words settle. That's what we carried, those of us who built quietly. The work didn't always put us on stage, but it shaped the scaffolding others climbed. Meanwhile, at my firm, Shay brought in a new partner. Mid-level, skeptical, sharp. From a fintech startup that had scaled too fast and now bled logic through every seam. First session, she said, "We tried to build for agility. Turns out we should have built for humility." That became a mantra. It went up on the office wall later that week. Agility fails. Humility scales. One day, out of nowhere, I received a message from Donovan. He rarely reached out, hadn't in months. It read, "I see it now. We didn't need someone louder. We needed someone quieter, with structure." I stared at it for a while. Typed, "Thank you." Deleted it. Then closed the tab. Not because I held a grudge. Because his clarity didn't require acknowledgement. When someone finally hears the architecture, there's no need to echo back. Later that week, Priya sent me a snapshot from OrbiX's new training deck, slide 14, Integrity Before Identity, Lessons in Attribution. She added no commentary. She didn't need to. They had begun training their new hires in the principle I had built alone in the dark, years before anyone knew it mattered. That was the redemption arc. Not for me. For the system. During a Friday sync, my team debated implementing a public-facing schema trail for one of our clients. The question, "Won't that expose us too much?" I said, "If exposure scares you, maybe the logic needs tightening." We launched it a week later. Uptime improved. Support tickets dropped by 42%. Client satisfaction quietly surged. And nobody remembered who had pushed the decision.
Perfect.
At a quiet dinner with my sister, someone who knew little about what I did, she asked, "Do they miss you now?" "The old company." I laughed softly. "They miss what I carried, not who I was." She frowned. "Is that enough?" "It's better," I said. "Because if they missed me, they'd just repeat the pattern. But if they missed the weight, they'd learn to carry it better next time." That night, I walked past the same glass conference room where Damien once stood, presenting my model as if it were his own. It was empty, but the table remained. The light hit it the same way. The screen glowed, waiting. And I knew, somewhere inside the system, my fingerprint still pulsed. Not visible, just functional. The loudest legacy is the one that doesn't require your name. Winter arrived quietly. Systems slowed. People moved a bit more deliberately. Projects wrapped not with celebration, but with precision. I liked that. It meant people were building to last, not to impress. In early December, a global tech magazine published an article titled "The Invisible Architects: Systems That Survived the Collapse." I didn't expect to be mentioned. And technically, I wasn't. But midway through the piece, a paragraph stopped me cold. At OrbiX, internal reforms around schema ownership and structural continuity were initiated not after public failures, but after a silent unraveling that revealed something profound. The strongest systems had been built by people who were no longer present. No names. No dramatics. Just truth. The journalist didn't quote me, but they quoted the principles I left behind. I printed the article and pinned it to our cohort board, not to gloat. To show the others that the world was starting to pay attention. That quiet builders, once dismissed, were being listened to, even if only through the ruins they left behind. That week, I held a one-on-one with Shay. She had just completed her first full systems audit. "None of it failed," she said, almost in disbelief. "We built it months ago, and didn't touch a thing. And it just held." I nodded. And
she paused.
Then said, "That felt more rewarding than any launch I've ever done."
Good.
She was learning. Because there's nothing louder than a system that doesn't need saving. I began to write again. Not notes. Not logic. But a guidebook. The Architecture of Absence. It wasn't a memoir. It was a blueprint. Short chapters. No fluff. Just principles born from the edges of collapse. One section simply read, "Build as if you won't be there to explain it. Because one day you won't be." I posted the first chapter anonymously. Within a week, it had been downloaded 3,000 times. Someone translated it into Spanish, then Korean, then Dutch. People began using the hashtag architecting quietly. I never joined the thread. I didn't need to. Back at OrbiX, a quiet evolution had taken place. The systems now had anchor tags for every critical function. Each tag contained not just an author, but a rationale. A small note that answered one question: why did this exist in the first place? That was my fingerprint, not the code, not the style.
The why.
Priya sent me a screen recording of a new higher orientation module. Slide 6. Legacy is not a person. It's a decision that held. Under it, a button labeled See Origin Trail. No mention of me, and yet entirely me. In a late December meeting, one of our clients shared a concern. What if this architecture gets too quiet, they asked. Too invisible? I answered plainly. Then it's finally doing its job. They laughed nervously. I guess that's good? I smiled. It's the best case scenario. Because here's the truth no one tells you. Legacy isn't cemented when you're praised. It's sealed when the structure you built survives without apology or explanation. And if the world forgets your name, that's fine. Just make sure it remembers your logic. You were never meant to be remembered. The system was. By the time spring rolled in, I was almost fully invisible. Not forgotten, just unnecessary. No one called me for clarifications. No one pinged me for quick fixes. No last-minute emergencies. No panicked requests for context I hadn't left behind. The system had absorbed everything it needed. It was breathing on its own. Shay had taken full lead on 3 major audits. Priya now trained new hires using a playbook she wrote, based entirely on our past mistakes, not our past excuses. Brian had implemented a system-wide routine that tested resilience by simulating a lead's sudden absence every quarter. And for the 3rd quarter in a row, the system passed. That was the goal, not perfection.
Continuity.
One Friday, a junior architect approached me after a cross-team review. I've been studying the anomaly framework, she said, and I think I understand it now. Not just the structure, but the philosophy. I nodded. Tell me what it is. She didn't hesitate. Design for loss, not loyalty. Make it stronger than the person holding it. I almost laughed. She had it. Around that same time, Donovan forwarded me a document. No preamble. The title, System Drift Forecast Model, FY Redline V4. Below the header, a note in bold. Original projection framework courtesy of CL Unmodified. I didn't reply. I didn't even open the full doc. Because that one sentence meant more than any summary ever could. They weren't evolving the model. They were relying on it. Later that week, Jared from Logenics sent me a message, just a link to a live dashboard. He had updated the backend to include a model lineage tracker. The top entry read, Langford Logic version 1.7, deployed 492 days ago, last manual override. Never, I clicked away, without a word. Because sometimes, the only response to longevity is silence. During a quiet morning walk through the park, I thought about Damien for the first time in months. Not bitterly. Just analytically. He had vanished. No new headlines. No second act worth tracking. Not because he failed publicly, but because his leadership couldn't survive scrutiny. That's the real erasure. Not being criticized. Being bypassed by systems that no longer need to pretend you mattered. At our next cohort session, I brought in no material. No deck. No talking points. Instead, I wrote one question on the whiteboard. What would your system do without you for 90 days? The room went still. Then hands started raising. Voices started layering. Answers weren't confident, but they were honest, which meant the shift was taking hold. That same week, Priya forwarded me a policy revision from OrbiX, effective immediately. All strategy pod structures will require 2 approvals. Original schema trace validation, absence scenario stress test. It had taken over a year. But the organization had finally rebuilt itself on a new foundation. Not me. The lesson. In early May, I hosted a roundtable on structural resilience with 3 architects from entirely different sectors, one from public health, one from aviation, and one from disaster logistics. They had never heard of me, had no idea about Orbiex. But when the public health designer said, "I build like I'll disappear tomorrow," I realized I had finally met my peers. Because truth doesn't need brand recognition. It just needs to last longer than the spotlight. The best legacy is one you never need to defend. I used to think closure came from vindication, from someone saying, "You were right." But it doesn't. Closure comes from irrelevance. Not the painful kind. The powerful kind. The kind where everything you built works so well, they forget you ever had to fight for it. Mid-May, Priya sent me a forwarded message. "Team, please replicate the Langford schema structure for the new vertical. Keep the original logic, no modifications. No context, no footnote, not even a mention of me beyond that single word, Langford." And yet, it was more honest than any award or framed certificate. Because that one line meant we stopped trying to improve what already worked. They had moved from rebellion to reverence. At my firm, we implemented a new policy. Last line, first review. It required that in every system, the final dependency was reviewed before anything else. No assumptions. No inheritance. Everything had to hold from the end backward. It was a small change, but it forced our designers to ask, who will be here when the edge collapses? If the answer wasn't clear, the system wasn't ready. During a review call with a manufacturing client, a senior ops lead said, "We've had 3 turnovers since deployment, and not a single disruption."
He paused.
Then added, "Whatever you anchored in there, thank you." I didn't correct him. I hadn't anchored it. I just made sure someone would. That week, I reread the earliest line in my notebook. Week 1, forecast model stripped of author tags. It didn't sting anymore. Now, it felt like a necessary test, like a prelude to the only kind of architecture that matters, one that doesn't collapse when the spotlight moves elsewhere. At our final cohort session before the summer, I asked each attendee to bring in a story of a time their work held without them. No failures. No collapses. Just survival. The room filled with quiet tales of systems that no one had to rescue, of forms that never broke, of processes that onboard strangers like they'd been built just for them. Someone said, "It's strange. The moment I stopped needing to be seen, my work became unmissable." We all nodded. After the session, Shay asked me a question in the hallway. "How do you know when it's time to step away from something that still needs you?" I thought for a long time, then said, "When they don't see you but they move like you taught them." She nodded. She understood. That night, I received one last message from Donovan.
Short. Direct.
"We're finally hiring for permanence, and I can see your work in every question they ask." I stared at the message, then deleted it. Not out of spite, out of peace. Because I no longer needed to collect receipts. I had built the vault. Walking home, I passed a storefront window and caught my reflection. No badge. No business card. No system trailing behind me. Just a person who once built something so well they didn't need to return to explain it. When the system walks without your shadow, you've done enough. Summer arrived with no ceremony, just light, heat, and the absence of anything urgent. It had been almost 18 months since I walked away from Orbiex. And yet, that structure still pulsed with the rhythm I gave it. Quiet, reliable, self-correcting. I hadn't touched it since. I hadn't needed to. One morning, during a stand-up, Shay presented a new model for adaptive escalation in failure environments. It was elegant, modular, low friction, and almost too simple. She walked through the logic, then paused and looked at me. I built it with one goal, that no one would need me to explain it. I didn't respond out loud, but inside I exhaled. Because that's the summit. When someone else builds silence into a system and does it by choice. Later that week, a request landed in my inbox. From a global logistics firm. They wanted a system overhaul, structure, process, attribution, stress routing. They attached a 3-page brief outlining everything they'd broken. And then a postscript at the end. Your frameworks are referenced by almost every department now, even the ones that didn't know your name. We don't need a leader. We need an anchor. I didn't reply right away, not out of hesitation, but because I didn't want to walk backward into something that now needed its own path. That Friday, I stood at the edge of the coast. No laptop, no signals, just tide and wind. And I thought about how far removed I was from the person who once had to document their own erasure just to stay sane. I remembered the pages, the audits, the slow dismantling of false narratives. None of it had been wasted. It had simply transformed. At our next cohort gathering, I brought in a blank page, wrote nothing on it, just handed it to each attendee, one by one, with a pen. Add only what a stranger could follow, I said. Some wrote flow diagrams. Some scribbled policy tags. Others just wrote reminders. Explain the why before you define the how. By the end, we had a page full of principles. No names. Just instructions anyone could survive with. We pinned it on the wall beside the earlier diagrams. A timeline made of absence. That same week, Priya messaged me. They tried rewriting the onboarding schema at Orbix. Deleted the original logic. It crashed in 6 hours. We restored your version from backup. No changes this time. She added one more line. The lesson finally stuck. It wasn't personal anymore. They weren't clinging to my model. They were defending their own stability. That was what I had hoped for all along. That the system would eventually learn to protect itself. Not out of loyalty. Out of pattern recognition. One evening, while reviewing Shay's latest deployment, I caught a comment embedded deep in a query cell. If no one ever sees this again, good. That means it's still working. I didn't know she'd written it.
She didn't know I'd see it, but I kept that line.
Printed it. Pinned it over my desk. Because in that one sentence, I saw the entire journey. The theft. The silence. The reemergence. The replication. And finally, the replacement. When others build with your logic, but not your name, you've succeeded. The final indicator came not in an email, not in a dashboard log, but in the absence of both. 3 quarters had passed. No alerts. No recovery flags. No critical handoffs. No one asked for the author. No one needed to. The system had disappeared into itself, exactly as it was meant to. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't have to. Because when the weight lifts and nothing collapses, that's the only closure a builder ever needs. That week, my firm submitted our final rollout for a public infrastructure agency. We called it Project Hollowbeam, named for the support structure that appears minimal but bears massive weight without attention. Our closing line on the report was simple. Redundancy isn't weakness. It's a kindness to the next person. The client approved it in 2 hours. I walked home slowly that night, past an alley where once, during the worst of it, I'd taken a call at midnight, trying to convince someone not to overwrite a risk model they didn't understand. Now, that same model had served 3,200 systems without failure. No patching. No press. Just permanence. Back at my desk, I found an envelope. Inside, a single card. On the front, embossed in plain gray. The structure held. No sender. No signature. Just 3 words. I flipped it over. Blank.
Perfect.
I placed it beside my notebook, still closed, still unedited since the last line I wrote. I would never open it again. Because this was no longer my story. It was theirs now. The next day, I closed the last admin session tied to my architecture. Input a single final directive into the platform's control schema. Upon last system trace execution, purge creator credentials. I hit enter. The platform didn't blink. No confirmation window. No confetti. Just acceptance. My name disappeared. Access revoked. Connection terminated. Session logged. Exactly as designed. I stepped outside. No fanfare. No glass walls. No boardrooms. No late-night whispers of stolen credits. Just wind. And somewhere in 5 different systems across 3 organizations, a structure I built continued functioning quietly, unclaimed. That was enough. Later that week, Shay stopped by my desk.
I heard, she said.
What? You logged out. I nodded. She hesitated, then asked, if the system never needs you again, how will you know you did it right? I smiled. Because they'll stop asking who designed it and just say it works. That night, I walked through the empty streets, the city cooling down behind me. No thoughts. No retrospectives. Just the hum of absence doing its job. Real closure isn't being remembered. It's knowing nothing broke when you left. If you've listened this far, then maybe you understand. This was never a revenge story. It was a resilience story. One where the real triumph wasn't reclaiming what was taken, but watching it outlast the people who tried to erase it. We spend so much time trying to prove ourselves in a moment, defend our titles, protect our credit, chase visibility like oxygen. But the truth? The only thing that ever survives the noise is structure. Not the people who scream loudest. Not the ones who sell the vision. The ones who built it to breathe without them. When I left, I didn't slam the door. I didn't publish a tell-all. I didn't even whisper that I was right. I just waited. Because time tells better truths than confrontation ever will. And if you build something with care, real care, not just competence, it echoes. In quiet dashboards. In systems that don't crash at midnight. In junior analysts who quote your logic without knowing your name. That's legacy. Not applause. Not permanence. Just quiet continuity in places where chaos used to live. So wherever you are, if your work has been overlooked, renamed, repackaged, or erased, don't rush to reclaim it.
Step back.
Step quiet. And watch what falls without you. Then smile. Because what stays standing, that part was always yours. Now, turn off the lights.
Close the tab.
Maybe take a walk, or just sit in the stillness. Let the silence remind you, you don't have to raise your voice to shape a world. Sometimes, the system itself is the only vindication you'll ever need. And that's more than enough. Collapse doesn't need force. It just needs the wrong hands holding what wasn't theirs.